The England Six Nations 2022 performance review. We're going to have a look at the record, some of the stats, and then talk about the verdict of the results for the English squad in the Six Nations. But yeah, we've done this for Scotland, Wales, and Italy thus far. We're moving on to the top three now. Top three is interesting because if you're looking at just purely the results, if you're looking at their spot on the table, England went up from 5th to 3rd. So that seems like a positive. Happy days. England's campaign up 2 spots compared to the rather disappointing 2021 campaign. But that's a pretty shallow look at it. It's still 2 wins and 3 losses. Last year, in 2021, it was wins over Italy and France. This time, it's wins over Italy and Wales. So it's bizarrely like the wins over the 2 teams who finished 6th and 5th that see England finish 3rd. It's a bit of a strange campaign all up this 2022 year. The points differential is ever so slightly better. They were at -9 in 2021. They're at +5 in 2022. So that's a very kind of shallow positive as well. But ultimately, I don't think it's the spot on the log that matters that much as the fact that it's still 2 wins and 3 losses. And you would kind of expect, I don't know, England fans I would imagine should expect to be finishing with a positive record most years. Don't know. Tries were down from 12 to 8, so that's certainly one area that's a little bit concerning for England as well. Conceded amount was the same both years, 11 tries conceded. So yeah, looking at those numbers, I mean, England didn't manage any tries against Scotland in 2021. 6 against Italy, 2 against Wales, 2 against France, and then 2 against Ireland. That's at least kind of steady. Whereas this year, steady Eddie, 1 against Scotland, 5 against Italy, and then 1 against Wales, none against Ireland, albeit that was a different game with the red card for as long as it was, and then 1 against France. So England's ability to score tries ultimately strikes me as a bit of a concern. Yes. So yeah, the record is what it is. I'm not going to be placing too much value into that personally. Stats-wise, it's an interesting one. I mean, for a positive stat, happy days. England's run meters are up. 383 was the average in 2021, 465 in 2022. But interestingly, if you look at all the teams, they're pretty much all up. They're pretty much all up. And one of the reasons for that may actually be the 50-22. With the 50-22... someone mentioned it in the Scottish video about how that's affected their defensive structures, which has made them a bit more susceptible in 2022 compared to 2021. It may apply to all the teams. They're able to get a bit more running. I think it was only France that was actually down on the amount of run meters they clocked up. Everyone else across the board has gotten more run meters. So with the wingers often hanging back a bit more, there is that bit more space. So that one might be a bit of a kind of false flag one if you're just looking at the run meters are up from 383 to 465, and that, you know, the laws of the game change, which may mean everybody's up. So if everybody's up, are you really up kind of thing. Clean breaks are down. I don't know how that works, but maybe, as I said, the 50-22 may be the answer because England were averaging almost 8 clean breaks a game in 2021. I never really felt England's attack was blunt in 2021, but in this 2022 Six Nations, it's down to 3.6. So, yeah, kind of poor. I did feel England's attack often was blunt in this Six Nations, as is kind of evidenced by the try-scoring record. I mean, clean breaks conceded was actually a little bit better in 2022. So it's not all doom and gloom. The attack was a bit blunt, but they were also able to shut teams down a little bit better, even if they did concede the same amount of tries as last year. They're kicking slightly more from hand, England, but not huge amounts more. They're offloading a bit more. Happily, though, one of the main troubling aspects of England's campaign last year was the amount of penalties they were conceded. That number is genuinely down from 14 to 10 on average. That's huge. That's only 4 penalties a game, but that's a massive difference. 10 is kind of the generally accepted mark as to what teams tend to aim for. You want to keep the penalties conceded 10 or less. So to go from 14, which is pretty high, down to 10 is actually genuinely quite good. So there's a bit of good news despite the seemingly lackluster campaign. I'm still finished third, so maybe I'm being a bit harsh. Now, the one thing that struck me is ultimately very troubling about the English campaign is the way games were finishing. It's a pretty clear and obvious stat, seemingly. Just looking at when England are conceding points, and it's at the end of games. The final 20 minutes. I like to break the games up into 4 quarters to see when the points are being conceded. England concede about half of their points. I think it's exactly half of their points in the final 20 minutes, which is bonkers if you think about it. I mean, the points for is kind of evenly spread out, but still their worst quarter is the final quarter. England score an average of 27 points. The total of 27 points in the first quarter. It'd be nice if it was an average. Total of 30 points in the second, total of 28 in the third. So 27, 30, 28, that's pretty even. But then they've totaled 16 in the final quarter. So, yeah, it's their lowest. They score 15% of the total points in that final quarter. Whereas points against, 50%, man. 48 points they've conceded. So they've scored 16, conceded 48 in the final 20 minutes in the Six Nations. That's bonkers. And I know the Ireland game where they had that red card for the majority of the game, and they conceded, I think it was like 17 points in the final 20 minutes to Ireland. That makes it look worse, but it's not an outlier because apart from the game against Italy where they didn't concede any points, England lost the final 20 every single game. To Wales, to Ireland, which I mentioned with the red card, to Scotland, to France. They lost the final quarter every single time. And it's a weird one because traditionally with the Eddie Jones teams in recent years, they came out of the blocks absolutely flying and got a lead against teams and were kind of hard to chase down, but they're not doing that. They've scored 27 points in the first 20 and conceded 23, so much of a muchness. There's not like a huge dominance there in the opening stanzas. I mean, the best part is that in the third quarter, England have only conceded 5 points. But then that's kind of negated by the fact that the floodgates seem to open for the final 20. So I'm not sure how you explain that one. Is it a fitness issue? Is it the bench being a bit too weak? Part of this English season kind of depends on, I guess, how much you read into or buy into what Eddie Jones says, because certainly Eddie in the last 18 months has been rejigging the squad from the one that was at the World Cup. A lot of guys who were, kind of core members of that World Cup squad are now on the outer, and he's certainly brought in a lot of new guys, which is pleasing, and he's got that line about how he thinks teams take 3 years to peak for a World Cup. Whereas other coaches, there's often after a World Cup, there's a changing coach and a bunch of players retire and there's a big rejigging of players. Well, England kind of kept that World Cup squad steady for the year after the World Cup and then have started rejigging. So in a way, they're kind of a year behind everyone else. But if Eddie's logic about it peaking within 3 years instead of 4, then maybe this is all part of the master plan and next year's going to be when they peak. They'll peak just at the right time rather than peaking early. So whether you believe Eddie or not, maybe is a big factor in this one. I also think England's midfield was pretty disrupted. I don't think we've been convinced by England's midfield. If Tuilangi had played, if Farrell had played, whether you hate him or not, I do think he adds some value there. So yeah, I don't think the midfield was kind of fully settled. But anyway, just that stat about them conceding as many points as they did in the final 20 is kind of nuts. But anyway, final verdict. Would you say England met expectations, exceeded expectations, or didn't meet expectations? I would still say they didn't quite meet expectations, eh? A win over Italy and a win over a Welsh team which finished 5th and only won 1 game is kind of disappointing. They certainly showed some fight in the Ireland game, which is one they lost. It's 2 years in a row they've gone down in a pretty tight arm wrestle with Scotland. I don't think a record of 2-3 is quite good enough. I don't think scoring 3 tries against teams that weren't Italy is quite good enough. So yeah, I'm going to say they were just below expectations. But we'll see. I'm kind of, maybe I'm just gullible, but sometimes I'm inclined to believe what Eddie says about the future of England. So fingers crossed he can build these guys. You don't make it to World Cup finals and have the record that Eddie's got unless you know a little bit about what you're talking about. So we'll see. We'll see if he's playing me for a fool or if he's going to kind of get things right. You guys let me know your thoughts. How would you validate or judge England's campaign for 2022? Do you think it's going to get better as we get closer to the Rugby World Cup? By the way, if you want English rugby gear, England Rugby Store, down in the description. They always do sales and whatnot, especially post-season. So, yeah, you guys let me know your thoughts, and I will talk to you guys again soon. See you later.